This episode contains strong opinions, real-world analysis, and perspectives that may challenge your current beliefs. The goal isn't to tell you what to think, it's to give you something to think about. In a time where headlines move fast and narratives shift even faster, it's important to slow down and ask what's actually happening beneath the surface. We encourage you to listen with an open mind, consider multiple viewpoints, and come to your own conclusions. Because understanding doesn't come from noise, it comes from questioning it.
There's a word being used right now that sounds calm. Ceasefire. It sounds like things are slowing down, like tensions are easing, like maybe, just maybe, we're stepping back from something bigger. But sometimes, the most dangerous moments aren't when everything is exploding. They're when everything goes quiet just long enough to make you think it's over. Because underneath that word, ceasefire, there's still movement. There's still positioning. There's still pressure building in places most people aren't paying attention to. And if you're not looking closely, you might miss the fact that nothing has actually stopped. It's just shifted. All right, let's bring in the crew, because this is one of those topics where surface-level takes aren't going to cut it. And I already know this group is about to take it in 4 completely different directions. Brian's here, ready to light the match 5 seconds into the conversation. Probably already convinced this isn't a ceasefire. It's a setup, a repositioning, and somehow also proof that nobody's actually in control of anything except the narrative. You know he's coming in hot, and honestly, I wouldn't expect anything less. Rachel's here to bring some balance back into the room before Brian takes us straight into DEFCON 1, breaking things down piece by piece, reminding everyone that not everything is a conspiracy, but also not everything is as simple as it's being presented either. She's going to walk that line between reality and perception like she always does. Daniel's sitting there quietly connecting dots that nobody asked him to connect. But by the end of it, you're going to be sitting there like, I didn't want to think about that, but now I am. Because if there's a deeper layer to this, and let's be honest, there usually is, he's already halfway there. And Skylar's here to push back on all of it. Bring it back to real-world impact, real people, and probably remind everyone that while we're sitting here debating strategy and power moves, there are actual consequences playing out in real time that don't care what label we put on them. And me? I'm just here trying to figure out if what we're being told actually lines up with what's happening. Or if we're all just being given a version of the story that's a little easier to digest. When you hear the word ceasefire, it creates a very specific image. It sounds like a step back, like things are cooling off, like maybe the worst has passed and we're moving towards some kind of stability. That's the word being used right now when it comes to Iran and the broader Middle East. But the more you actually look at what's happening, the harder it is to square that word with reality. Because while there may be a ceasefire in one lane between the US and Iran, the region itself hasn't stopped moving. Israel is still actively striking targets in Lebanon. Hezbollah is still engaged, and one of the most critical pressure points in the world, the Strait of Hormuz, is sitting there as a constant reminder that this doesn't just stay regional. It goes global fast if something shifts. And then you add in reports of high-level targets being taken out, rising casualties in ongoing strikes, and competing narratives about what is and isn't covered under this so-called ceasefire. And suddenly, this doesn't look like de-escalation. It looks like something being managed. And that's where this starts to feel less like clarity and more like controlled perception. Because if parts of the conflict are still active, if different fronts are operating under different rules, and if the situation can escalate quickly depending on what happens next, then calling it a ceasefire doesn't necessarily mean things are stable. It might just mean they're being framed that way. So here's the question that really matters, and this is where I want to start this off. Are we actually looking at a situation that's stabilizing, or are we looking at a situation that's being presented as stable while pressure continues to build underneath? Brian, I'm coming to you first, because from a strength, strategy, and reality standpoint, does this look like things are calming down to you, or does this feel like a pause before something bigger?
This doesn't look like stability to me at all. It looks like controlled optics. Because if you've got a ceasefire headline on one side, but at the same time you've got continued strikes, leadership targets being eliminated, and active conflict through proxies like Hezbollah, then what you really have isn't peace. You've got compartmentalization. And that's dangerous because it creates a sense of calm that doesn't actually exist on the ground. You don't take out a major figure tied to a group backed by Iran and call that de-escalation. You call that a move that could trigger the next response. And that's the bigger issue here. Iran doesn't operate in a straight line. They operate through networks, through layers, through influence that spreads across multiple countries at once. So even if one part of the system looks quiet, that doesn't mean the system itself is quiet. It just means the pressure is being applied somewhere else. And historically, when things start shifting like that instead of resolving, it's usually not because everything's fine. It's because something is being repositioned. And that's exactly what this feels like.
And that's what makes this uncomfortable. Because what you're describing isn't chaos, it's structure. And structured tension is a lot harder to read than open conflict, because it doesn't look dangerous until it suddenly is. Rachel, let me bring you in here, because there's a difference between incomplete information and intentional framing. From your perspective, are we looking at a complex situation being simplified for the public, or is there actually a gap between what's happening and what people are being told?
I think the most important thing to understand here is that complexity often gets reduced into something more digestible. And that doesn't always mean it's misleading. It just means it's incomplete. What we're seeing right now isn't a single conflict with one clear path forward. It's multiple overlapping situations happening at the same time. The US and Iran can be in a ceasefire posture while Israel continues operations against Hezbollah. And both of those realities can exist simultaneously, even if they feel contradictory when presented together. But where the concern becomes valid is in how people interpret that information. Because when the public hears the word ceasefire, they tend to assume broad de-escalation, not a partial pause within a much larger and still active system. And right now, that distinction matters. There are still active military operations. There are still high-stakes pressure points like global energy routes. And there are still multiple actors with the ability to escalate quickly. So even if nothing is intentionally being hidden, the simplified version of events can create a perception of stability that doesn't fully reflect how fragile the situation actually is.
And that right there, perception versus reality, that's where everything seems to live right now. Because if the situation underneath is more unstable than the version being presented on the surface, then what looks calm might actually just be quiet pressure. Daniel, I'm going to hand this to you because this is where you usually start connecting dots that don't show up in the headline. When you look at this, ceasefire in one lane, escalation in another, what do you think is actually happening behind the scenes?
What stands out to me is the separation of conflict lanes, because that's not accidental, that's strategic. When you isolate a ceasefire to one relationship but allow pressure to continue through proxies or adjacent regions, you create flexibility. You can reduce direct confrontation while still maintaining leverage across the board. And from a systems perspective, that doesn't look like resolution. It looks like redistribution. Pressure isn't disappearing, it's being moved. And when you layer in something like the Strait of Hormuz, now you're not just dealing with regional conflict, you're dealing with global leverage. Because influence over that passage affects energy markets, shipping routes, and economic stability worldwide. So the question becomes, is this about ending conflict, or is it about reshaping how that conflict is applied? Because those are two very different objectives. And right now, this looks a lot more like the second one.
And that's where this stops being just strategy and starts becoming reality for people. Because when pressure shifts like that, it doesn't stay contained to maps and policy discussions. It shows up in real-world impact. Skylar, bring us back down to ground level here, because regardless of how this is being framed, there are real consequences tied to this. What does this situation look like from that perspective?
From the ground level, this doesn't feel like a ceasefire. It feels like instability that's being labeled differently. When there are still active strikes, rising casualties, and uncertainty about what might happen next, the terminology doesn't change the reality for the people living through it. The risk hasn't gone away, it's just become less visible to those outside the region. And globally, this kind of instability doesn't stay isolated. When you start talking about pressure on major shipping routes or energy supply chains, that eventually affects everyday people through prices, availability, and economic strain. So even if the situation is being described as controlled or stable, the broader impact suggests otherwise. And I think that's the disconnect, because what people are hearing doesn't always match what's actually unfolding.
And that's the part that's hard to ignore, Skylar. Because no matter how this gets framed at the top level, the reality on the ground doesn't care what label gets used. You can call it a ceasefire. You can call it stabilization. You can call it progress. But if people are still living under the threat of strikes, if leaders are still being targeted, and if entire regions are still operating under tension, then that word starts to lose its meaning. And I think that's where the disconnect is happening. Because for people watching from the outside, it sounds like things are calming down. But for people inside it, nothing actually feels calm. And what really stands out to me in all of this is how layered it's become. This isn't one conflict anymore. It's multiple moving pieces happening at the same time, each one operating under its own rules, its own timelines, and its own consequences. You've got diplomacy happening in one lane, active military operations happening in another, and global economic pressure sitting right in the middle of it all. And when those things aren't aligned, when they're all moving in different directions, that's not stability. That's a situation that can shift very quickly depending on one decision, one strike, or one miscalculation. So when I step back and look at this as a whole, it doesn't feel like something that's settling. It feels like something that's being managed. And there's a big difference between those two things. Because something that's settled is predictable, but something that's being managed is only stable until it isn't. And right now, that's what this feels like. Not the end of something, but a moment in between where everything is still very much in motion.
All right, before we move on, let's take a second and talk about something we can control: how you show up. If you're rocking with the show, if you believe in speaking your mind and thinking for yourself, then it's time to represent that. Head over to the Data and Dissonance merch store, where we've got everything from hoodies and hats to mugs, stickers, and the coffee blends that keep this whole thing running. Whether it's the High Lakes Light Roast, the Rock Creek Medium, or the Bitterroot Dark French Roast, you're not just buying coffee, you're backing the message behind the mic. Grab your gear at data-and-dissonance.printify.me/. Because this isn't just a podcast, it's a mindset.
You know, the more I sit with this, the more I keep coming back to one simple idea. Words don't always match reality. And ceasefire is one of those words that sounds like closure, like resolution, like something is winding down. But what we're seeing right now doesn't feel like something winding down. It feels like something shifting into a different phase, one that's harder to see, harder to define, and honestly, harder to trust. Because when conflict becomes layered like this, when it spreads across different regions, different actors, and different types of pressure, it stops being something you can clearly point to. It becomes something you have to interpret. And that's where things get dangerous, because interpretation depends on perspective, and perspective is shaped by what you're told, what you see, and what you don't see. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Not that something is being hidden, but that something isn't being fully understood. Because understanding requires context, and context doesn't fit into headlines. It takes time, it takes attention, and it takes a willingness to look beyond the surface. And in a world that moves as fast as this one does, that's not always easy. But if there's one thing worth holding on to, it's this. Don't confuse quiet with calm. Don't confuse labels with reality. And don't assume that just because something sounds stable, that it actually is. Because sometimes the most important things aren't what's being said. It's what's still moving underneath it. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
This episode is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, a story built on truth, tension, and the kind of questions most people are afraid to ask out loud. If you're into high-stakes narratives, layered conspiracies, and characters that operate in that same gray area we talk about here on the show, then this series is for you. Start with the Covenant Protocol, continue with the Prophet Directive, and get ready for what's coming next with Black Echo Rising. These aren't just books, they're an extension of everything we talk about here. Power, control, perception, and what happens when someone decides to dig deeper. And while you're at it, don't forget to check out the music. Uncaged and Four-Wheelers and Hallelujah, streaming now, because the message doesn't stop when the mic turns off.